Alexander Bridge is Part 1 and in for a tremendous adventure. I officially left drama school in Birmingham on the 22nd of July 1992, following a singing showcase at the Duke of York's Theatre London. It had been a happy and eventful 3 years, but now it was time to put all the training to a test, if that was possible, in an already overcrowded profession. Looking back, I hadn't a clue where to start. I'd done all the usual begging letters to the reps, agents and casting directors before I left the school, urging them to come and see this exciting and diverse character actor with a wide playing range in our final showcases. Whether any of them ventured out to the Duke of York's, I will never know. But my one lifeline was a card that had been passed on to me at the acting showcase a few months earlier for none other than the great Barry Stacey. Now, Barry Stacey demands a blog all of his own, and if you can get hold of either of his books, A Ticket to the Carnival or Life Upon the Very Wicked Stage, they are a very good read. He still works and lives in the heart of the West End, a short walk from the Phoenix Theatre on Charing Cross Road. The many actors I've worked with all have their own Barry Stacey stories, but nothing disrespectful, and all paying tribute to his great encouragement and the ability to keep us all in work. I rang Barry the week after leaving drama school and went to see him on the last day of the month. Always brisk and to the point, he filled in all the forms, ticked the boxes, and then said, "Your photos are crap, love." Well, looking back they were rather, having been done by a local photographer in Birmingham, but as our college had endorsed his work, it was the blind leading the blind. I followed that meeting with an audition at Danceworks in Balderston Street. My diary doesn't report what that job was for, and just as well, but I have a feeling it was not a success. I know there was one audition around that time that concluded with me slipping out unnoticed from the back of a dance audition and running screaming from the venue. After a new photo session by a lovely man called Anthony Hyam, whom I last saw when he popped his head round the stage door of the Malvern Theatre in 2005 after Round the Horn Revisited, it's funny how we all catch up over the years, I returned to Mr. Stacey armed with the new images that were to make me a star. Mr. Stacey seemed satisfied, or maybe pacified, and told me to pop over to the Beck Theatre, Hayes, the following afternoon to have a singing audition for him and watch his West End to Broadway. Sadly, Barry doesn't produce these concerts anymore. After the show, I went backstage and saw the musical director to arrange a singing audition for Barry. I think I sang Song on the Sand from La Cage aux Folles. Barry seemed to be deep in conversation with the theatre manager during my audition, but when I finished my song, to the usual spontaneous indifference, Barry called out, "I might be able to use you as a number 2. To this day I've never worked out what he meant, and found the description of my singing rather a cause for concern. A couple of other unrelated and fruitless auditions followed over the next couple of weeks, and then, on the 20th of August, I had a phone call. Anyone who's ever worked with Barry or been represented by him will know what I mean when I say, when Barry phoned you, you grabbed a notepad and listened for all you were worth. It was a pure listening exercise, and trying to take in the barrage of information that was being fired at you was like rapid gunfire. The basis of it all was that he'd fixed me a job as an acting ASM in a tour of A Murder Has Been Arranged, and for Barry I was to play a gypsy boy in his Hansel and Gretel, which was always doing random dates at random theatres around the country. I asked who the producer of the tour was, and received the reply, "Mama Bridge." At the time, the name meant nothing, but within a few days that name was to have a marked impression on my life and my career for the next 20 years. The following day I went over to see my dear friend Philip Leather, the last partner of the late and great Douglas Byng, and I told him my good news. When I mentioned the name of the producer, Alexander Bridge, Philip's expression said it all. Philip had auditioned for La Bridge a few years earlier for Panto and a tour of the Hollow, but never ended up working for him. But he was full of stories. Philip told me about his experiences with the impresario and just said, "Watch the eyes." The next few days I spent arranging digs and checking the logistics of this very short tour. 3 weeks, in fact. I had a synopsis of the play, my tried and tested Samuel French Guide to Selecting Plays, 87th edition, 1990 to 1993, and writing this blog, I don't think I've looked at that synopsis for 20 years. I duly ordered a copy from French's, and figured out I'd be playing the smallest of the roles. Cavendish, the band conductor, pleasant, ordinary. What a way to make one's professional debut, but we all have to begin somewhere, and I'm sure a lot of rep actors started their careers with far worse. I rang Barry Stacey a couple of times to clarify a few things and realised this wasn't a good idea. Barry was and still is very busy and a proactive agent who didn't appreciate flapping or panicking. I did manage to glean that the company I'd be working for was already in Chesterfield and set about finding a contact number at the now familiar Pomegranate Theatre. In those days the stage door number was the payphone by number 6 dressing room, and guess what, after 20 years it still is. I rang and eventually spoke to a very deep Essex voice that was to have the same impact on my career as Mr. Bridge and Mr. Stacey. This was Bruce James. Bruce James was, and still is, as different from Alexander Bridge as chalk and cheese, but I gathered he was the business partner in the company, so I knew I was at least talking to the right person. He confirmed I would be playing Cavendish, and outlined the tour dates, rehearsal, etc. He also took my home phone number and arranged for the legendary Mr. Bridge to call me when convenient. Within a few hours, and after curtain had gone up on the current show at Chesterfield, Mr. Bridge phoned me and pretty much confirmed what Bruce had said. In those days I was probably more conscious about contracts than I am now. The number of times I've started a job and handed the completed contract back to the producer a few days later. But at the end of the day, your word is your bond, and that is how I have always worked. I'd like to think that in the theatre that still works on both sides, but somehow, to quote Barry Stacey, I fear not. Mr. Bridge told me contracts would be sorted out via Barry, which I found somewhat odd, but was to find out the reason why a little later. He also gave me the number of a highly recommended landlady in Calo, just outside Chesterfield, by the name of Joyce Hunter. I think I've got the surname right, but can't find a trace in my diary or any digs lists. There really was nothing more to be done. I made sure I was word perfect before going up, if only that were true today, but I always make sure I've learnt scripts thoroughly prior to rehearsal, wherever possible. I've never subscribed to the maxim about not trying to learn lines prior to rehearsal until you know how the other actor is going to say theirs. To my mind, that is sheer laziness. Dora Bryan's comment in her autobiography, According to Dora, says it all. Always make certain you know your lines, and always remember that no one is indispensable. You have to be able to survive a few knocks, and also be prepared to have the nearest thing to a heart attack on opening night. Speaking for myself, I've learnt that it is best to have God on your side. I've learnt to hand over to him on opening nights. I say I've done my bits, I've learnt my lines, so it's all in his hands, and I feel calm and protected. Another important thing is to keep your sense of humour, and always remember there's another world outside the theatre. Above all, pray for guidance in everything. The following day I went down to Lewisham Theatre to witness Barry Stacey's Hansel and Gretel, in which I was due to take the world by storm in my portrayal as the Gypsy Boy. Bearing in mind I was just approaching 26, but from which direction? I entered the foyer to find Mr. Stacey sat at what appeared to be a car boot sale, but which I rapidly ascertained was the show merchandise, to the cry of, "Witches' hats, fingernails, bags, colouring books. Witches' hats, fingernails, badges, colouring books." I approached Barry just as a young child approached the grotto and proceeded to examine the merchandise. So, without pausing for breath, the following exchange took place. "Witches' hats, fingernails, badges, colouring books. Witches' hats, fingernails, badges, colouring books," noticed his small child. "Witches' badges, fingernails—" "Oh, fuck off! Hello, David!" Hansel and Gretel was interesting because amongst the cast were two wonderful people with whom I was to work and become great friends, Andrew Ryan and Nigel Ellicott. Nigel created and still runs the most informative website on Panto in existence, www.itsbehindyu.com. and if there's anything you need to know, it's all there. Both Andrew and Nigel are terrific actors and pantomime dames, and Nigel was part of the best Ugly Sister double act ever with the brilliant Peter Robbins, who sadly died in 2009. I never actually got to meet Andrew and Nigel that afternoon, but Andrew and I were to work on many shows and with quite a few companies in the years to come. I'd got wind that rehearsals for Hansel and Gretel were limited, so I wisely took my tape recorder and made the first of many private handbag recordings. It would take too long to give a critique of this show, but I became an avid fan of any reviews of Barry's shows in the stage by the late Patrick Newley. I also don't recall hanging about for too long after the show. Shock, I suppose. After a relaxing Sunday with my old flatmate from college, it was time to embark on my professional debut. So, at 15:30 p.m, I boarded the train to Chesterfield with its cobbles, quaint theatre, twisted spire, and an even more twisted series of events over the next month. My lovely landlady met me at the station and drove me back to her house. I seem to remember she had 4 lovely cats. Toffee and Charlotte are the only ones I can remember, though. Joyce was a godsend, as she provided a relaxed environment, loved the theatre, and took a real interest in everyone who stayed with her. She asked me who I was working for, and when I told her, her face had the same reaction as my dear friend Philip, and at this stage I started to get rather worried. Joyce tactfully told me that she'd had many actors from Mr. Bridges' company, and quite a few of them had, euphemistically speaking, been known to reach for the knife drawer very early on. So it was with a dubious heart that I boarded the local bus into Chesterfield and made my way through the foyer of the now familiar Pomegranate Theatre, and was duly shown through to the auditorium, where bang centre of the stalls, immaculately dressed in a grey suit and with very penetrating eyes, was the legend himself, Alexander Bridge. The bizarre roller coaster had started. Part 2. The Adventure Begins. Indeed, it was a roller coaster that I was to keep getting aboard for the next 20 years in one way or the other, and I was to work with some wonderful people who rapidly became dear friends. But back to that evening on the 24th of August 1992. The first thing that struck me about Alexander, or Peter Bridge, apart from the aforementioned eyes, was the fact that he very rarely raised his voice. But then he didn't have to. He had an aura about him that commanded respect, or which certainly made one in awe of him. When I arrived that night, the company was about an hour away from opening night of Willie Russell's musical Our Day Out, and I appeared to have walked in after an eventful dress rehearsal. Mr. Bridge appeared to be having an argument with the stage manager, and it seemed to be something about sound and microphones, but whatever it was went straight over my head on that first night. The Pomegranate Theatre was, and still is, a beautiful auditorium. It was the converted Corn Exchange, and it has a wonderful intimate feeling to it, as well as excellent acoustics. After the contretemps with the stage manager, Mr. Bridge turned to me, and with those eyes burning my silhouette on the wall of the theatre commanded, "So you're David Rumelle, are you? Come to my dressing-room." With such a powerful command, how could one refuse? Over the next half hour, Mr. Bridge quizzed and questioned me, and I tried to find out as much as I could about him. Within the comparatively short space of time, I realised that Mr. Bridge had an affinity with the old musicals, and had produced a fair few of them over the years. This gave me a good excuse to break the ice and express my own interest in old musicals, particularly the works of Coward and Novello, on which Mr. Bridge appeared to be an authority. I also discovered that his real name was actually Peter, but there had already been a famous director, Peter Bridge, who had produced Wait Until Dark and had worked on early shows for Barry Humphries. Over the next hour, I was introduced to the stage manager, John Port, and the musical director, Russell Drake, with whom I was to spend a lot of time over the next few months, in one way or another. I sat and watched the opening night of Our Day Out from an empty dress circle, sat next to Peter, and wondering what on earth I was going to encounter at the following day's rehearsals. Our Day Out was actually a local youth project, with Peter's company playing 3 of the main parts. These three actors were also to play in A Murder Has Been Arranged the following week and the subsequent tour. Our Day Out was a charming little show, very simply staged, but with an energetic young company having a glorious romp with this Willie Russell musical. After the show, I was introduced to the three actors with whom I'd be working with. Simon Barry, Deborah Karen and Bruce James. Again, two people with whom I was to work for a long time. Peter invited Russell, John and myself to join him for dinner across the road from the theatre, at an Indian restaurant, I think, and it seemed wise to accept. A pleasant evening ensued, and I couldn't help wondering what all the warnings about Peter had been all about. The following morning I walked into Chesterfield for the first day of my professional career. It was a beautiful morning, and the views of the twisted spire on the horizon were very quaint. The nearer I got to town, I also discovered the delightful smell of refreshers and love hearts, as Chesterfield was the home of the old Trebor factory, now also sadly demolished. So too was the lovely little cafe across the road from the theatre, run by the inimitable Ivy. Ivy's cafe was the first port of call on the rehearsal day, and Peter could always be found in the window holding court with whoever had chosen to pop in. I quickly realised that if Ivy liked you, she would charge you a very low price for the meals, but if she didn't, she would up the price. Rehearsal started at 10:30, and I quickly met and introduced myself to the rest of the company. Apart from the three cast members I'd met the night before, the leading man was Mark Burgess, who played one of the first gay characters in a soap opera, Gordon Collins, in Brookside, who now lives in Brighton and with whom I've worked with Brighton Review Company. There were two girls, Julia Binns and Lorraine Ashley, who had at short notice replaced the two girls who were advertised on the poster and who had mysteriously opted out. The two older female roles were played by two delightful character actresses, Maggie Stables and Jessica Barnes, with whom I was to work with in the very near future. Such was the setup with Peter's company. They were very much a family who worked with the same band of players if they fitted into the company and were good team players. As I was on stage practically as soon as the curtain went up, I was more than a little nervous on that first morning. And to say I was on stage was not strictly true, in fact. The only time I appeared on stage in that play was at the curtain call. I was playing the leader of an orchestra who spent what little stage time there was wandering around the auditorium and the orchestra pit. And as the budget or the technicalities of the show couldn't extend to an orchestra, the lines were changed, so I became a sort of 1930s DJ putting on records. It wasn't the most auspicious of starts, but it was a part. In addition, I was ASM, which meant scouring the streets of Chesterfield for the necessary props. Fortunately, the set was very simple, and the prop list not too extensive. So it was a fairly gentle start. I can't have looked at that script until writing this account, and I was delighted to find Peter's original set design in his own hand in the back of my script. Also, I'd been lucky enough to have done practically every backstage job in a drama group when I was about 13, and had attended a drama school where ASMing and DSMing were compulsory in our first 2 years, so I was well prepared and well organised. Rehearsals with Peter were legendary. He was in his element when he could jump up and play the scene himself for you. Never in a nasty way, but obviously enjoying himself, especially playing any of the ladies' roles. He also had a wonderful melodramatic style of direction, which reminded me of Max Adrian in the film of The Boyfriend. This Damian Williams thriller was not the best piece of English theatre, and was somewhat dated, having been first produced by the author in 1930. It concerned a party on the stage at the St James's Theatre, and resulted in a murdered man coming back as his own ghost to name his killer. So there was every chance for comedy moments, of which there were many. As soon as the first blocking rehearsals were complete, I set to making a detailed list and checking what needed sourcing, buying, or what was already in stock. Peter seemed very impressed with my accounting and organisation, and this set me off on a good foot. I even found myself going on in Our Day Out as part of the crew when one of the kids was ill. Well, I was delighted to do it after all. I was in rep, and was now a working actor. On the Thursday of the rehearsal week, I reached the age of 26, and Peter very kindly treated me to dinner that night, along with Russell and John, who seemed very much part of Peter's family. I was probably closest to them both during the early stages of that production. The rest of the cast took themselves off fairly quickly after rehearsals, as we only had a week, and the play was very wordy. Part of my duties involved reupholstering a piano stool and varnishing a table and benches. Now, the only time to do this to ensure they were dry in time for the following week was to do it before the Saturday matinee of Our Day Out. I set to in the theatre workshop with varnish and brush, and admit that the smell was a bit overbearing. But no one had told me that this was where the animals for Our Day Out were kept, prior to appearing on stage. Now, OK, the animals only consisted of a rabbit and a couple of gerbils, I seem to remember, but I almost reduced the animal cast with one stroke of my varnish brush. The following weekend was a bank holiday, so we technically had the Monday off, even though the cast had agreed to meet up on Monday evening for a line run, given we were opening the next day. At the end of the Saturday morning rehearsal, before the matinee and final performance of Our Day Out, Peter took me to one side and kindly offered to lend me some tapes to listen to. There was something in the way he said, "Don't tell anyone I've lent them to you. They wouldn't appreciate them the way you do," that made me uneasy, but I didn't suspect a thing. He also made a point of asking if there was anything he needed to bring up from Southend, his home, for the following week. I duly gave him a list of everything we needed, and we parted company at the end of that first week, feeling very happy, and a feeling that I'd done my job to the best of my ability. On the Sunday, my landlady Joyce took me out for the day with her good friend Maggie. They took me to a well dressing, which is a local custom in Derbyshire, and down Speedwell Cavern, a local tourist attraction that mines the famous Blue John stones, on an underground boat trip reminding me very much of the labyrinth in Phantom of the Opera. Maggie gave me a piece of blue glass that I still have to this day. She invited Joyce and myself back to her flat for tea, and I quickly realised the calm aura and atmosphere of her home was due to her being what is commonly known as a white witch, but which I now know meant that there was a wonderful spiritual awareness about her, and she used her spiritual gifts to help others. I remember when she gave me the piece of glass, her words were, "For the white one." I didn't quite understand what she meant at the time, but in later years I realised she must have seen the spiritual potential that I had myself, but still haven't used to the full. When we got back to Chesterfield, John and Russell offered to take me over for a drink at Simon Barry's Country Digs as a way of getting to know each other. A pleasant evening ensued, and I got to know more about this curious company. Simon had worked with Peter, Bruce and Debbie for many years, and indeed was part of Peter's inner sanctum, as it were. The three of them tactfully told me a few warning stories about Peter, and how I should be careful not to be lulled into a sense of false security. Part 3. My opening night, my debut, and my first ever tour. The following day being bank holiday, the cast weren't called for rehearsal, but had agreed to meet in a local hotel that evening for a line run. Russell, John and Simon all decided to go for a drive in the Derbyshire Dales during the day, and very kindly asked me to join them. As the day went on, I gleaned more and more about our producer. It seemed that he went through ASMs and knew people to the company like hot dinners, and was well known for his mind games and amusing himself at the new boy's expense. He'd often ring Barry Stacey in London and ask, "What have you got new for me?" Hence my summons to Chesterfield. By all account, it didn't make me feel any easier, but I was grateful for the warning. But where was the catch as far as I was concerned? Well, the catch came the following morning on the get-in. The set couldn't have been easier to put up. About 4 flats, a couple of rostra, and some masking, not back-breaking stuff. And then Peter arrived to light it. I use the word loosely, as his lighting rig consisted almost entirely of reds and greens, perfect for any panto, but not entirely suitable for a mouldy old thriller. Still, I suppose it was bordering on melodrama. Just before lunchtime, and with the final dress rehearsal looming, John asked Peter for the sound tapes for the show. Thereby came the catch, and the first of the little games which very nearly destroyed any trust I might have had for the impresario. He informed John that he hadn't been told by myself to bring any tapes back with him for the incidental music. But what you could use is some music that I lent him over the weekend, him being myself. He turned to me with what soon became a recognisable gloat and asked, "Have you got them with you?" smiling wickedly. Of course, the tapes were still in my digs up the road, and Peter had planned it perfectly that they were. He knew that the tapes contained the music he wanted to use for the show all along, and this was transparently obvious to John and myself, who then wasted our lunch break driving to get them when we could have been preparing for the dress rehearsal. John knew this as well, and could only look apologetically at me as if to say, "We tried to warn you." The dress rehearsal was a fiasco and bordering on the hysterical. The whole plot revolving around a lord who gets murdered and comes back as his own ghost. Now, during the play, his body was supposed to be in a curtained alcove at the back. But so that Simon, playing the lord, didn't have to spend the entire play in the alcove, the back window had a secret door he could escape from. Unfortunately, he hadn't checked his script to double-check when he needed to be back on the set when the curtains were drawn back. The cast were doubled up when the whole object of their dialogue was happily seeking composure with nicotine in the dressing room. Peter also had a thing about putting his leading men in tights, for whatever reason, and as for the majority of the play, the two other male members of the company, Bruce and Mark, were in period costume. It was a good excuse to produce the most revealing tights imaginable. I suppose I was lucky that my role disappeared fairly early in Act 2 before the costume changes for everyone else. Several of the cast slipped on a dodgy carpet and corpsed unashamedly during the dress rehearsal. At the end of it all, there were a lot of red faces, all fearing the worst. Surprisingly, though, the worst never came. Peter merely said, "Well, you all know where you went wrong," and swanned off to his dressing room to await the opening performance. Even though I was playing a comparatively small role, there is always a pressure on any opening night, and as this was my debut, as it were, I couldn't help but feel the pressure. It wasn't made any easier by the fact that I had to make an announcement for the two girls who weren't billed in the programme, and then rush round front of house for the first entrance. This was made from the back of the auditorium and down the centre aisle, which meant having to slip in unnoticed at the top of the show and sneak along the back row as soon as I saw the house lights go down. I managed to get through the auditorium door okay, but heard a few angry mutterings of "Latecomers, typical," from a heavily upholstered Derbyshire lady. But then we were off, and not really surprisingly, the show flowed very well, probably due to the heavy dose of adrenaline that was pumping through everyone. All was going well until the end of the first half, when dear Maggie, playing Lady Jasper, dried completely. Her line to Simon should have been something along the lines of, "Charles, call your secretary." But she had forgotten everything at this point. Very helpfully, Simon stared her in the face and very pointedly said, "Shall I call my secretary?" If ever there was a more pointed lifeline, that was it. Maggie looked at him incredulously for a moment, and we all thought she'd take the lifeline that had been thrown to her. Instead she paused, looked around the cast, then back to Simon, and screamed, "No!" Well, that was that. Nowhere for the scene to go, and it came to a crashing halt, and reduced Act 1 by a good 5 minutes. Not that there was any great loss. I don't think anything else eventful happened that night, and as weekly rep went, it wasn't too horrendous. Peter seemed pleased in the bar afterwards, and asked if I would do some paperwork in the office for him the next day. Again, how could I refuse? Mind you, he did pay me overtime. The following day, after a bit of work in the office, Peter arranged with Russell that I should sing for him with a view to pantomime and the tour of A Christmas Carol he was putting on in October and November. For some reason I had Noel Coward's bar on the Piccolo Marina with me that I'd used in the final showcase to great acclaim. Mr. Bridge was rather less impressed with my interpretation of Mrs. Wentworth Brewster, telling me that Noel would never have written a song about such a common woman as that. Bang went that bit of self-confidence, but after trying a few other things out later in the day, he asked if I'd like to play Bob Cratchit, which is a gift of a role for anyone. He even handed me a script there and then. Not bad, I thought, for week 2 of my career. I can't recall any further problems with The Murder Has Been Arranged, apart from some fairly horrendous drives through the night after the get-out. John was driving the van in those days, and a couple of times I had to stop him falling asleep at the wheel at 3 a.m. He was so tired after 2 performances and the get-out. Our next port of call was Yeovil, a lovely little modern theatre in a very quaint Somerset village. We had the added joy of 5 of us sharing a delightful little cottage in the town of Crewkerne, a few miles away. Simon had the cottage next door, which meant that the majority of the cast were all staying together, and a good excuse for chatting and having the odd drink until the small hours. Unfortunately, Peter had wanted us all to stay in The Gables, a hotel just down the road, and I feared the worst when I didn't accept the offer to join his little enclave. However, nothing was said, so I was safe at least for the time being. Yeovil was uneventful, apart from our lovely actress Jessica being poorly one night, but being the trooper she is, she manfully got through her very dramatic scene in the second act. We then moved on to the last venue, the Key Theatre in Peterborough. Always a pleasure to return to, even though it has seen many changes in decor and management over the last 20 years. When I first went there, it was managed by the wonderful Mr. Derek Colleen, who I realised I'd last seen at drama school when he came to direct A Voyage Round My Father, a wonderfully kind man who always had time for everyone, from the names right down to the ASM. I was able to stay with my friend Richard Brett, who I first met when he was company manager in Ladies' Night in 1991. Funny how life turns around. For 10 years later I ended up in that very same show. The theatre is on the river at Peterborough and is a delight to play, not only for the beautiful views from the dressing room window, but the lovely intimate atmosphere of a small horseshoe-shaped auditorium. Again we opened with little problem, and then on the day after we opened came the bombshell which almost ended that brief career. Peter asked me, "What are you doing next week?" I replied that as the tour was at an end, I'd be going home. "No, you're doing old-time music hall for me at Bognor Regis." Again I could hardly refuse. It was another week's work, and as I'd already achieved my next role in Christmas Carol, I was on a roll. Peter explained that I'd have to learn an opening song and dance and a music hall medley, which Bruce would teach me, and we discussed a solo number. I knew a few music hall songs in those days, but not the extensive repertoire I now have. As I loved the old musicals, Peter suggested a medley from Lionel Monckton's The Arcadians, which I knew very well. The opening number, A Night at the Music Hall, was an infectious little tune, easy to learn and good patter lyrics. Looking back, the dance steps were not complicated, just fast. I'd always shied away from dance at drama school, probably because of the innate fear of getting it wrong, even though we had a very understanding dance teacher from the heart of Birmingham, with a dialect to match. If you can imagine her shouting, "Nice box steps, everybody," you'll get the picture. Bruce taught me the steps, and it helped me on the more complicated ones, and I probably learnt more about dance and movement in that 1 week than in 3 years. I assembled the medley for the Arcadians myself. I think I borrowed the score from the local library, and, as per Peter's instructions, and spent every spare moment practising for the following week. We closed Murder Has Been Arranged on the Saturday, a brief but enjoyable tour, and at some stage I was to work with every member of the cast again in the not-too-distant future. John and I drove through the night to his home in Sittingbourne, and after a very minimal sleep, drove down to Peter's house in Lee-on-Sea. The address is still in my address book. I must pause at this moment as the mind games and the testing were about to begin in earnest, and I very nearly rose to the bait and chucked the whole lot in just 24 hours later. Part 4. A brief sojourn into music hall. After very little sleep and an afternoon's rehearsal ahead of me, it was little wonder that I was a little on edge. But Peter announced that he was taking myself and Mother out to lunch. Mother was otherwise known as Eileen Farrow. If ever there was a transformation when this character appeared on stage, this was it. She shuffled around Peter's home in a pair of old carpet slippers, looking very much like a home help in one of those old rep productions. On stage, however, Peter dressed her up in tulle and feathers and wigs that had seen the hairdressers many times. She also adopted an air of one who had just walked out of a number 1 dressing room, whereas at home her accent was apt to drop. I suppose she thought she was another Anna Neagle, but without that star quality and that one essential quality for a singer, a decent voice. Peter wined and dined us at some restaurant or other in Southend, but seemed remarkably cold considering I'd just toured for him. Lunch finished and paid for by the impresario, we headed to the scene of so many rehearsals in the years to come, the church hall behind Southend Central Station. There I met pianist John Puddock and the juvenile dance troupe that Peter employed for panto and other occasions. Rather than having them doing a physical or vocal warm-up, Peter had them emptying the skip from A Murder Has Been Arranged and hoisting the furniture upstairs to the balcony in the hall, which served as Peter's prop and costume store. Then we began rehearsing in earnest the opening routine, A Night at the Music Hall. I'd never run through it with a pianist, and I never had the chance on this occasion. It was straight into what Bruce had taught me, almost like being on the Generation Game, but without a sympathetic audience. I barely made my first entrance when Peter bellowed, "No, you can't come on like that." The rehearsal ground to a halt while Peter gave me a lesson in how to make an entrance in music hall. We resumed the number, but it wasn't long before we were stopped in our tracks once again. It was all too clear that Peter was hell-bent on having fun at my expense, diminishing my confidence and showing me up in front of his dance troupe. Coincidentally, I'd also been coerced by Peter into performing for no fee at the British Music Hall Society a month later with more or less the same show we were rehearsing. We ploughed on with the routine, stopping at every opportunity Peter could think of to thoroughly humiliate me. And that was only the opening routine. Bruce had talked me through the other songs in the music hall medley that was to open Act 2, and into which I was to be interpolated. But once again, I had never had any chance to run through this with a pianist, or Bruce and Debbie in full rehearsal. With only 2 days rehearsal, it was painfully clear I was never going to learn the routine that they had been doing for years, and boy oh boy didn't Peter revel in it. "Your problem is you're not relaxed enough." How could one be with such a cold and gloating attitude on the other side of the footlights?
"David, you don't throw your hands to starboard, you will be in a terrible mess."
After the troupe had gone home, Peter asked me to run through the Arcadians, again the first time I'd put the medley together with a pianist. First of all, he blamed me for putting the songs together in the wrong order when I'd paid special attention to his instructions whilst we were in Peterborough. And then it was a case of, "No, you're singing it like Gilbert and Sullivan. Lionel Monckton should sparkle." I doubt if Lionel Monckton or his leading lady Gertie Miller could ever sparkle with such a negative influence on their confidence so early in their careers. At the end of the rehearsal, I had the encouraging comment, "Don't worry, everyone has a nervous breakdown on music hall." I wasn't at all surprised working with such a bully. At the end of this dreadful Sunday, Peter then dropped me off in his taxi to the most dismal B&B known to man. I've been back to Southend many times, and have grown to like the place, and have had many fun times there. But for years after, I was scarred by the experience and this awful B&B. It would have been the perfect setting for an M.R. James ghost story. Oh, how I would have loved to have nailed the kipper to the back of the wardrobe on my departure. The crazy thing was that had I known how near I was to London and my dear friend Richard in Upton Park, I could have gone back there, drowned my sorrow in a litre of gin and good company, and have been de-stressed. As it was, I wandered round Southend without a clue where to go, eat, or to seek solace, utterly wretched. Ironically, Southend's main gay bar was just up the road from the digs, and practically adjacent to the rehearsal room. But nil desperandum, the show had to go on. Noel Coward wrote the best riposte to that theory. After a dried-up breakfast served by the proprietors of this dreary incarceration, whilst arguing off-stage throughout the service, I paid my £12 for the night and made my way back to the hall at mid-morning on that Monday for the next step in this diminishing of confidence and 3 years of training. We started with the second act medley, with myself muddling through more choreography than I could cope with. Bruce and Debbie finally took pity on me, and taking the bull by the horns, Bruce tried to give me confidence in saying what I'd achieved in just a week with the opening routine. Debbie said the same, conceding that they'd both been doing the routine for years, and here was I being asked to do it overnight. Once Bruce and Debbie had gone, Peter really went to town, aided and abetted by our actual pianist for the show, none other than Mr. Michael Topping. To be fair, Michael was in no way responsible for Peter's bullying, but he was constantly being asked to back Peter up. Michael had in fact been the first onstage partner for Patrick Fife before he met George Logan and the legend that was Hinge and Bracket was born. At the time we were doing our show, Michael was working with George Logan during a break in the Hinge and Bracket relationship. We ran through the Arcadians medley several times, and it's a wonder to this day that I still love that show and its wonderfully infectious music. Anyone else would have burnt the vocal score there and then. Peter was vile about it and made comments of "no style, no presence," and other goading adjectives. It had been agreed that I would perform the medley in blazer and straw boater, very end of the pier. But Peter had other perverse ideas. The only way to make this work is for you to play it as an Athenian boy. When I inquired about the hidden meaning behind this concept, the impresario smiled evilly and repeated, "Dressed as an Athenian boy," with an evil wink at Michael Topping. Peter gathered his coat, fedora, and the aforementioned pianist, and gave me my final note. "Well, I hope you come up trumps by tomorrow." That was the straw that broke the camel's back. As soon as they'd left the room, I flung the nearest coffee cup at the wall and trembled all over in anger, frustration, and sheer exhaustion. A couple of girl guide leaders came into the hall briefly, saw me sobbing uncontrollably, and left right rapidly. John Port and Russell Drake arrived about half an hour later, as John was due to pick up some costumes and set from Peter and ferry it down to Bognor Regis the next day. My face must have said it all. I asked John to drop me at Southend Station. I'd actually no idea where it was in relation to the hall at that time, but I was going back to Birmingham and throwing the lot in. John paused for a moment and saw my dilemma. To this day I don't know if I would have carried out my threat, but I was too upset to think rationally. John and Russell then did their utmost to convince me that I'd now passed the new boy test. Russell assured me that once we'd opened with the show the next day, Peter would leave me alone and be satisfied. He also reiterated that I'd already been promised a main role in A Christmas Carol, and it was likely I'd be cast in pantomime for that year. They both urged me not to give in, and both promised a nice meal and wine at their home in Sittingbourne that night to help me unwind. But before that, we had to go back to our beloved impresario to pick up props and costumes, particularly mine. Peter was still in an evil mood that night and ordered me to go upstairs at his home whilst he found an old floral dress. The next bit is pure farce. In front of John and Russell, Peter then proceeded to cut the Oxfam cast-off into an approximation of an Arcadian Greek toga affair, but at the end of the day, it looked like a blue floral Oxfam frock cut down. John, Russell and I became hysterical and turned the whole thing back on Peter, saying it should be cut shorter and shorter until the outfit bordered on the obscene. This must have proved too much for Peter's weak heart, and he ordered us to leave quite quickly, bidding us Godspeed to Bognor for the get-in and the next day. Howling with laughter, we got into John's van and drove down to Kent for a brief night of wining and dining. Difficult to believe I'd been on the verge of a breakdown less than an hour before. The next day we drove down to the Alexandra Centre, Bognor Regis, a very tired and white elephant of a theatre, bar, leisure complex in Bognor. To my knowledge it still is. We assembled some very sad and tired drapes and a backcloth that had seen better days. Peter arrived at midday and, looking at the minimalistic setting, remarked to me, alluding to the red swags, "Those were all that was rescued from the Palladium fire." To this day I've never ascertained which Palladium he was referring to, or if it ever had a conflagration, but judging by the condition of the tired velour, it would have been kinder to have let combustion take its course. I also seem to remember Peter giving me some lecture on how no one would ever teach me how to get a laugh, and I think by that point I really had just switched off and was letting professionalism take over. Even then Peter wasn't done with rubbing salt into the wounds. One of the guest artistes was Richard Griffin, the then Young Magician of the Year. He was quite an unassuming lad who must have been equally bemused by the antics of Alexander Bridge. He arrived at the theatre during the afternoon of that opening night and asked if I minded if he could put his doves in our dressing room. He was such a cute guy, he could have stored anything in there as far as I was concerned. The next thing I knew, Peter was descending on me like a velociraptor, saying how I'd upset Bruce, who apparently, due to being in the same room, was allergic to the feathers. I never did check to see if this were true in all the years I subsequently worked for Bruce. We opened the show that night, and as Russell predicted, the pressure was off. Also in the cast was the late Jack Seaton, the chairman of the British Music Hall Society, Larry Barnes, stage partner of Maggie Stables from A Murder Has Been Arranged, and of course the legend that was Eileen Farrow warbling various songs that were incomprehensible from row L in the stalls. Diction was never her strong point, just a wall of sound, all vowels and very few consonants. It was easy to see how she could have been the inspiration for Dame Hilda Brackett, but Patrick Fife's wonderful creation had far more stage presence and charisma than Miss Farrow ever possessed. Peter had booked us all into yet another dreary B&B opposite the theatre, the Mimosa, owned by a lady called Di, who obviously liked the odd sherry. I found myself sharing a room with the young magician of the year. Well, that was one high spot of the show, but his doves did awake at dawn, which saved me setting an alarm clock. And so the week croaked on. There was bugger all to do in Bognor Regis in September, and we all just tended to humour Peter at breakfast with his well-told tales, and then run back to our rooms and mill around town for the rest of the week. We did have a day off on Friday, and our young magician ran screaming for the hills, and the rest of us were obliged to join Peter for another dreary Friday out with Mother and Jack Seaton. But it was just another excuse for Peter to hold court and be the centre of attention. I distinctly remember Mother being vile about how the stage management looked after the stage furniture. Well, the second-hand stuff that Peter had used for years. One got the impression from Ms. Farrow that she was a West End star. Years later, I discovered that her professional engagements were rather limited and due, almost entirely, to her entrepreneurial son. I recall Mark Burgess came over to see us in Bognor, more out of sympathy than anything, and we passed a few consolatory words and looking forward to the forthcoming tour of A Christmas Carol. The week ended amicably, and John and Russell let me stay at their cottage in Sittingbourne on the Saturday night, before embarking back to Birmingham late on Sunday afternoon. If only I'd known, though, how Bognor was to play a vital part in my life, merely 3 years later. Part 5. A Christmas Carol in Bognor, in October.
Oh, he was tight-fisted, a squeezing, wrenching, covetous old sinner. Cold within him, iced his speeches, dipped his pointed nose.
In between finishing the music hall at Bognor and starting rehearsals for A Christmas Carol, I did have an extra gig, unpaid, with the established team at the British Music Hall Society meeting place near the Barbican. Typical of Peter, he announced that we were actually performing at the Barbican. After the trial period of A Murder Has Been Arranged at Music Hall, I was wary about the next instalment in the already established past drama school season. However, A Christmas Carol is a gift of a show to be involved in, and Bob Cratchit is a gift of a role, so I wasn't going to let that go to waste, and I knew I could do a good job of it. I've always maintained that A Christmas Carol is one of the best stories ever, and even in the most mediocre of productions, the joy of the story and characters shine through. Rehearsals began for A Christmas Carol at the Concert Artists Association in Berwick Street near London, a step back in time if ever there was one. It's since been the site of many rehearsals, auditions and theatrical gatherings, but back in 1992, and having done all I possibly could to have learnt the role of Bob Cratchit and Dick Wilkins, I turned up at the CAA armed with enough provisions for a tour of the Antarctic, including a typewriter, much to the amusement of the first person I met from the cast, a lovely lad called Craig Barrett, with whom I was to become great friends during the brief tour. Bruce and Debbie arrived with Peter, and then the rest of the cast trickled in, including 2 people with whom I was to work a great deal over the next 20 years. Andrew Ryan is a joy and pleasure to have in any company, and his name on a cast list is enough to lift everyone's spirits. And secondly, the amazing Damian Williams. Damian has since forged a career as an excellent pantomime dame and comic actor, but in those days he was fast becoming a protégé of Alexander Bridge, and cutting his teeth like the rest of us. Russell Drake and John Port were already good friends from the previous tours, and the company was completed by Mark Thrippleton from EastEnders and Samantha Michelle and Mark Burgess playing Charles Dickens, who was to join us later in the rehearsal process. It was a far more relaxed atmosphere to assemble in than the highly charged atmosphere of the Pomegranate Theatre in Chesterfield. Rehearsals began with music calls for a specially written score by John Puddock, nothing groundbreaking, but a very catchy score and easy to learn, which was just as well with so short a time to learn an entire show and open the following week. Listening to my rehearsal recordings from those first days, it showed what a camaraderie there was so early on, but then that is always the way with theatrical folk and professionals. No time to waste with building friendships, we just did it.
So that you've in fact got the entrance, and the whole thing goes into reverse with the R sounds within it for the exit. Does that make sense to you? So in fact you've got
Within a couple of hours we'd just about nailed the opening number and the first number for the men, Scrooge, which was later to be staged with hysterical fiddle-on-the-roof style choreography, and then we broke for lunch. And then, as could only have happened during the Alexander Bridge years, disaster on a national level struck, in this case a courtesy of the IRA.
That's just the entrance music really, and then you actually go next door, which is part of the Fezziwig Ball, which has got lyrics to it.
After lunch we were just learning some more of the score when the doors of the CAA burst open and the police stormed in and told us to clear the building. Apparently a bomb just up the road at the Sussex pub near Leicester Square had gone off, and even though it mercifully didn't have tragic consequences as so many other atrocities had done, the area was being cordoned off. Alexander Bridge remained totally unfazed and merely glared at the police officers with contempt and proclaimed, "I'm producing a show." As we were escorted out of the CAA, leaving all our baggage behind, Peter swanned down Berwick Street and onto the Strand, wearing his famous fedora, proclaiming to the world, "If we give in to them, they've won." We sought refuge in a basement bar on the corner of Berwick Street, some of us needing alcohol to steady our nerves, or just seizing the opportunity. After about an hour, we realised that rehearsals were pretty much a no-no for the rest of the day, so the majority of the cast departed. I, alas, had to remain, as all my luggage, clothes, etc. was still in the CAA, and the charming secretary had not returned to reopen the building, even though the road was now open. Myself and the chef at the CAA paced up and down outside, until we realised the only way we were going to gain access was via a major break-in plan. So we scaled the outside of the building from the rear and found an open kitchen skylight. The only problem was the drop. I suppose it was a tribute to my agility and sheer devil-may-care of those days, but I found myself crawling through the skylight and into the top of the kitchen and then dropping 10 feet into the kitchen. Not too horrendous, but enough to have caused an injury if I hadn't landed properly. I thus reclaimed my baggage, enabled the resident cook to get in, and repaired myself to stay with my dear friend Richard in Upton Park. Over all the years in the business, it was a blessed relief to stay with Richard, as he knew all about the comings and goings of the business, and was ready to have a welcome plate of pasta and a large gin at the ready after a long day of rehearsals. Many a laugh, tear and nostalgia were exchanged over the table of that beautifully bohemian flat. I wish I'd thought to take photographs at the time. The next day was a case of catching up on lost time, learning even more music, consolidating what we'd learnt already, but I don't recall any blocking taking place until the following day at Southend, at the formidable church hall, where I'd very nearly chucked the whole business before it had even started. I seem to remember us missing Southend station completely on that first day, rather silly as the hall was directly behind it, and raising a wry smile for Mr. Bridge. Blocking began in earnest on the Wednesday, including the opening number and the pseudo-Jewish choreography of Scrooge. And it really was a case of learn it straight away and do it. Even the prop list for the opening number when we unpacked a hamper was only given to us once by Mr. Bridge. He was not going to repeat it, not even for ready money. I seem to remember rehearsals progressed well and the show came together fairly smoothly. Mark Burgess as Charles Dickens didn't join us until later in the week, as he was reading from a lectern and really didn't need to worry about our shenanigans on stage. The main casualty of the script and score came about by Mr. Bridges' lack of planning. There was a concerted number called London Cries, the entire company playing street vendors. I seem to remember I was selling chestnuts, roasted chestnuts, in a very deep basso profundo. The number was quite tricky, but it would have worked, but for some reason Peter blew up at Russell over it when it was actually his own fault for not planning set and costume changes. Crazy really, knowing how easy it is to switch between characters in an ensemble production. But it was consigned to the bin with only the memory of Andrew Ryan's plaintive cry of "Spanish onions" to raise a smile when the going got tough. Bob Cratchit is a lovely role to play, and I'd love to have another crack at it one day, particularly in the musical Scrooge, which we were to see with Anthony Newley during the run of our modest little show. There is so much to get your teeth into: warmth, pathos, and even a bit of comedy. The most poignant scene is when the spectre of Christmas yet to come shows Scrooge that Tiny Tim has died. I didn't want Bob's breakdown to be self-indulgent, but I knew it had to be heartfelt, and so made sure for the first run-through I was totally in the moment. Unfortunately, Deborah Karen, as my wife, seemed to find it rather amusing and burst out laughing. I could have easily added her to the Cratchit's mortality list. We finished rehearsals, as most bridge shows did, on the Saturday afternoon, and John, Russell and I collected costumes and bits and pieces from Peter's house, dodging Mother, minus her wig, and then repaired to the lovely surroundings of John and Russell's cottage in Sittingbourne for the weekend, despite a Sunday of set and prop collection to get through the length and breadth of the country. Sadly, in the early hours of the morning, a phone call brought the sad news that Russell's father had died. John and I dropped Russell at the station, and then drove up to Hanley to pick up a rather dilapidated revolving set that had obviously seen better days, and then back down to London, Deptford I think, to pick up more set and costumes from the late John Roscoe, and then, this was already 7 p.m, on to Hastings for lights and smoke machines from panto producer David Lee. One must remember that La Bridge shows operated on a shoestring budget, and it really was a case of beg, borrow and steal what we could, and John Port drew on all his contacts to get what he could for the show. So, by the time we had made the round trip back to Sittingbourne, it must have been nearly 1 a.m, and we then had to be in Bognor Regis for a 9 a.m. get-in. Take heed, wannabes, or anyone who thinks show business is glamorous. Arriving bleary-eyed, sleep-deprived, and anxious about a forthcoming technical day was not an ideal scenario for any bridge show, but it was par of the course. Thankfully, we weren't opening that night, but in any case, A Christmas Carol in Bognor Regis in October was rather premature. It reminds me of that old quote, "How do you think Goodnight Vienna will go down in Wolverhampton?" Answer, about as well as Goodnight Wolverhampton will go down in Vienna. In those days, smoking was allowed in dressing rooms and backstage, and so there was a clear designation between the smokers' room and the non-smokers, even though, being the first venue of the short tour, everyone was anxious to bond, myself included. Peter swanned in at around lunchtime, and by this time he had hired a lovely ASM driver in the form of Steve Hallam, with whom I was to appear in Robin Hood at Graze later in the year. Peter, in grandiose style, showed me the pile of costumes, and as I was technically employed as an actor ASM, I was therefore wardrobe mistress. However, Peter's gleeful demand that he see everyone on stage in costume within half an hour, including the local children, was nothing short of vindictive, and I'm afraid from that moment on I really did begin to lose faith in the whole bridge experience. These days, of course, you would never get someone to costume minors in a show unless there were proper chaperones and or CRB checked, which I have now been for many years, but back in the early 90s, dressers and backstage staff etc. were all unchecked and taken on trust, which is what it really should be, but which sadly leaves people in very vulnerable positions. I dressed on a national tour of The Sound of Music in early 92, and since then heard one of the kids we dressed had been vindictive enough and manipulative enough to get a dresser at Birmingham Rep the sack and in a lot of trouble. So please don't think that the innocents are always so. But back to Bognor. Mercifully, Deborah Karen stepped in and sorted the kids out, but it was still a tall order to sort out an entire company within so short a time span, and to my mind just plain stupid and vindictive, and to satisfy some bizarre sense of power. By the time the technical rehearsal began, the company had some sort of costume assembled, as per Peter's plot, which I still have in the back of my script to this day, and we began the laborious run-through. At every given moment Peter stopped the run and demanded where certain items of costume were, when we were all trying to cope with costume changes and to bear in mind the impending opening night the following evening. Decisions I'd had to make without Peter being around were just treated with scorn, and the insults from the man were flying everywhere. During the second act, Deborah Karen had to physically hold my hand to stop me advancing to the front of the stage to give him a mouthful. I don't think I have ever felt so angry at such ignorance and vindictiveness in my career. Throughout this whole episode, the question that I asked was, why? Peter could have endeared himself to so many more people if he had treated them with the respect that he commanded himself, and which a lot of us gave to him. I think from that moment on I distanced myself from the man for evermore. A great shame, as I owed a great deal to him. A far cry from the halcyon days of working for New Palm less than 10 years later. But I'm jumping ahead. I think we just about got through the show that night, and then repaired to the delightful confines of the Mimosa Guest House again, the scene in my previous stay during Old Time Music Hall. We tried to get a house or flat for a selected few, but alas it had fallen through, so back we were at the Mimosa in all its tatty seaside glory. There was one luxury, however. Steve Hallam and I had adjoining rooms with a communal bathroom in the middle, almost like a suite, so it became the penthouse for many a cast party during those early days of production, with the result that at the end of the week it smelt like a brewery and a tobacco factory. Breakfast in the Mimosa was strictly between certain hours, and the morning after the show opened we all overslept and were woken up with a deafening thud of landlord on bedroom door and the monotonous cry of 9:30, causing half a dozen of us to grab clothes and scamper downstairs to a tepid breakfast and stony looks from our producer. I'm sure boarding school would have been less traumatic. But the show had opened, and a charming little show it was for all that. The cast were lovely, and even though it was only mid-October, the spirit of Christmas had somehow pervaded Bognor Regis. But, with my luck, fate had one last trick on the final performance in Bognor. I was due to travel back with John and Russell on the final night and stay with them before travelling back to Birmingham for a couple of weeks off before resuming the tour. However, due to Peter's insistence on their taking various costumes and props back in the back of their car, I was unable to be accommodated and was thus homeless on a Saturday night in Bognor. The other actor ASMs had buggered off to get their last London train, leaving me to the elements. And so thank you to the kindly crew member who offered me refuge on his living room floor until the first train out on Sunday morning. And thank you for whoever left the Tesco trolley outside the flat to help me get my luggage to the station in the early hours, and thus on to London and Birmingham. The rest is an absolute blur. I think I got myself back to my Birmingham flat, but I really can't remember. I just know I was exhausted after this last chapter, which really should be called A Bridge Too Far. There then followed 2 weeks off as Peter was rehearsing his rep season in Chesterfield, and Bruce and Debbie were in the first of the plays, Bowing, giving us the luxury of 2 weeks off, unpaid of course, but we resumed the tour at the world-famous City Varieties Theatre in Leeds, famous for the good old days. John and Russell met me at Leeds Station in order to drive us to our digs for the week. In the early 90s, the cheapest digs in Leeds were a series of self-contained flats and beds called The Tops, and owned by a gentleman called Peter Miles. Ours was ironically overlooking a graveyard. They were situated about 2 miles out of town, which necessitated the need for a taxi, which further bumped up our expenses. That, coupled with the hungry coin meters that controlled the electricity, further made the prospect of a week there a little daunting. The place was freezing cold and the hot water was decidedly ropey, and after the first couple of showers in the morning, everyone had to take pot luck. 6 of us were staying there that week. Mark and myself, John and Russell, and Craig and Samantha. Looking back, it wasn't a horrendous week. It wasn't exactly a humdinger either. City Varieties Music Hall is a beautiful theatre from front of house, but backstage was sadly lacking in space and amenities. The stage is famously one-sided, meaning that you could only enter from the stage left side, and if you tried exiting stage right, you ran into the side wall. The dressing rooms were small and basic, and we ended up sharing with 4 of us that week. Deborah Cowan had wisely bagged the number 1 dressing room on the ground floor on the excuse that the stairs were impractical with the ladies' frocks. I almost believed her. We had a new set of kids to rehearse in during the afternoon, and when we finally got onto the stage, we found that our revolved set was actually overhanging the front row of the stalls and the space where Russell would have his keyboard. We just started reblocking certain scenes when the technical manager from the theatre dropped the bombshell that because our set was blocking the fire safety curtain coming in, we couldn't use the set. So faced with the prospect of performing the show in black curtains, we began further reblocking. At about 10 o'clock that night the cast were dismissed, and John resigned himself to staying overnight in the theatre to light the show in time for the 10 a.m. show. When we got into the theatre the next morning, we discovered the theatre had come up with 2 backcloths from the good old days to assist us in our endeavours. So Fezziwig's warehouse subtly became a baronial hall, and the exterior of Scrooge's house became a street that just about every artist on the good old days had performed in front of at some stage. The performance was an interesting one that morning, as we all strove to come to terms with the new blocking, but we got there, and that seemed to be all that was remarkable about that week, other than my parents venturing up to Leeds to see the show in its reduced form. The following week we were going from one extreme to the other, performing in the biggest venue yet, the old Theatre Royal at Hanley. Sadly the theatre itself has long disappeared, or at least converted. All I can remember about that week is there were loads of dressing rooms, and the getting on the Monday took ages, just delivering costume to each room. Andrew, Craig and I had very wisely opted to stay in some bedsits nearby, as John, Russell, Mark and our ASM were sharing a dorm-type room in the next house owned by the same landlady. After the tense atmosphere during the opening of the show in Bognor Regis, I hadn't spoken to Peter since the last night there, where his parting comment, "You have the makings of a fine character actor," only just made up for his demeanour towards me during the technical rehearsal. Needless to say, when he put in an appearance in Hanley, I kept a low profile. He still found cast members to have a go at, in this case Mark Thrippleton and Damian, saying, "I didn't write your scenes like this," and alluding that Damian was playing Old Bill akin to Bill Sykes. Well, it was Dickens after all. Nothing else dramatic happened that week, apart from the news on the Friday night that Windsor Castle was ablaze. That night every lyric alluding to generous fire and such like took on a whole new meaning. Being so close to Birmingham and hardly ever having an evening show, we were able to have a night out to watch the premiere of Scrooge with Anthony Newley at my old stomping ground, the Alexandra, where I had long worked as a dresser and front of house. I had in fact been offered the job of dressing Frank Finlay and Anthony Newley, separate weeks and separate shows of course, but my own tours prevented this. But the job did go to my dear friend Morris, who subsequently was asked to tour with Newley on Scrooge the following year, and later in his cabaret at the Café de Paris, London. I can only say we were humbled to say the least at seeing such a spectacular show in comparison to our rather basic production. There were a couple of members of the company who had worked for Peter Bridge in the past. Lorinda King comes to mind, and the atmosphere in the bar afterwards was rather cool to say the least. At the end of that week, Mark Burgess was driving back to his home in Brighton, and I would in due course meet up again and work with him within a very short time of myself moving there. And he very kindly dropped Craig and myself back to my flat in Birmingham. So I had an unexpected Sunday off and a relatively easy journey on the Monday down to Somerset. And so back down to Yeovil, to end the all-too-short tour. In those days Yeovil had a very full digs list, a long cry from the final time I visited the Octagon in 2012 with a bed for the foreigners. On this occasion we stayed again in the small cottage in Crewkerne, sharing with John and Russell and Craig and myself. I'd grown very close to Craig during that time, probably a little too close, but propriety dictated that we just remain friends, which was a good job, as I would subsequently be playing opposite Craig's partner Chris in Robin Hood, with a rather tricky sword fight, so it might have become more realistic if any liaison dangereuse had occurred. We had a high old time in Yeovil, simply because it's such a beautiful theatre, so well equipped, and one of the biggest stages for a provincial theatre. Peter always referred to it as the Yeovil, for some strange reason. However, Peter as usual was staying at his favourite guest house, the Gables, in which he was trying to ensconce the entire company. But we were having none of it this time after our Bognor experience in the Mimosa. Steve Hallam was firmly in Peter's grasp as personal assistant, and one night after John, Russell, Craig and I had had a few libations at the local hostelry, and Russell was overdue to meet Peter for a meeting at the Gables, we emerged to be caught in the headlights of Steve's car and the shining silhouette of Peter's dome looking out of the fog at us. He later gave Russell the withering response, "You've been to the pub, haven't you?" During the week we invited the company back to ours for pizzas and drinks, and the wine flowed liberally in our lovely little cottage, knowing that the end of the run was upon us. These days I don't often get sentimental over the end of a run of a show, but this was my second tour, only one more week than the first, and with the gift of a part such as Bob Cratchit, I will readily admit I was very sad about it coming to an end. I'd made some wonderful friends, several of whom I would work with again and again over the years, but the last night came as it must, and having had a fantastic time by and large, we all went our separate ways, as Bruce put it, to dash off for pantomime. My mum and dad and my sister and brother-in-law came to see that final performance, so I was able to get home in style. I was sad to see the all-too-brief tour come to an end. It had been a great show to be in, and give me that next step up the ladder of experience. And it wasn't too long before another first, my first pantomime, my first villain, and the course on which I was set.
Why does he follow me about? Wait for me when it's my night out. Why? Because he loves me. Why does he always ask for more? Kiss me behind the kitchen door. Why? Because he loves...
Part 6. Robin Hood at Graze. There was at least a 3-week gap between the end of A Christmas Carol and Robin Hood starting rehearsals. During that time I cultivated the Bob Cratchit sideburns into a full beard, which would be coloured black. I was pretty confident about how I would play the role, but I was also dubious about how Peter would behave. Russell had told me horror stories of how Peter behaved when he was in drag, particularly to his principal girls. I was also very worried about the sword fight, which Peter had already tested the waters, asking, "What's your sword fighting like?" with that look in his eyes that I'd come to understand only too well. I tactfully asked if Peter would set it in phrases, the term for breaking down the components of a stage fight, to which he replied, "Depends how I'm feeling." In those days, and generally playing villain, I didn't add anything to the script, not that I would have dared, and was probably the only pantomime I've never doctored, but I wisely got the script well learnt in advance. Rehearsals commenced in Southend at the usual church, the dent of a smashed coffee cup ringing in my ears from the music hall rehearsals. We had a lovely cast in Jamie Golding from Grange Hill as Alan Adale, Chris Holt as Robin Hood, Alan Terry taking over the role of Dewberry as Bruce had landed a dame role at the Beck Theatre, which was later described in the stage as the butchest dame this season. Steve Hallam was Will Scarlett, taking over Alan's original role, and Peter was Dame, and myself was the villain, the Sheriff of Nottingham. Ironically, Peter was actually very charming during rehearsals, and despite a few rather anal lectures about how to sweep on for the opening scene, a note that went for nothing once we saw the insert set, and a few bits of made-up historical rubbish about the Grey Monks of Graze, I actually can't believe we sat and listened to this pile of rubbish, rehearsals were relatively easy. We did come to the dreaded setting of the fight. In this case it was done with fencing foils, and, mercifully, Peter set it in phrases, and as my fellow Robin Hood was a dancer, it was all counted with precision. I can't recall any difficulties with it, and when friends came to see the show later in the run, they were impressed by my stage combat skills. In fact, the only member of the company who did seem to get it in a neck as Peter's scapegoat was the musical director, whom Peter constantly had a go at. Rehearsals went well, and within a week we were in the characterless surroundings of the Thameside Theatre Graze, a carbuncle if ever there was one, and having no redeeming features whatsoever. It was a 60s library complex, and the theatre was more like a lecture theatre, with the stage only a couple of feet high, no wing space, and dressing rooms under the stage. Peter had his dresser and general assistant, who was forced to share a dressing room with him as well. I fared better sharing with Jamie, who played Alan Adale, and the two lads playing one of the babes and the dragon, respectively. The other 3 boys were next door, and Helen, as Maid Marian, in an awful fawn wig courtesy of Peter, was in solitary confinement on her own. The show was virtually technically rehearsed and dress rehearsed in one evening, apart from Peter, who didn't attempt costumes or make-up until the opening night. Unheard of, I suppose, in this day and age, but he was a director and producer and could call the shots, and considering all his entrances were done from the same side of the stage, stage left, and he was permanently sat there with his dresser doing everything around him, there wasn't much that could go wrong. His costumes were interesting, to say the least. The traditional dame frocks with loud prints were very good, particularly the opener to each act, but in between times there was a very bizarre assortment of ladies' apparel, negligées, odd punk-like creations, and even the occasional lady's cocktail frock for the ghost gag. But he did change on every entrance, even if there were seconds in between. I reckon he probably racked up at least 15 changes, the most I've ever done myself as Dame. Peter's only note to me was to be a little less forceful as villain when I was working with him as Dame, as if the Dame was less of a threat to the sheriff than the male characters were. He needn't have worried. I was not going to cross paths with him. Remarkably, there were very few traumas on the run. Peter got a bit mad with Helena's maid Marion a couple of times, but I seem to remember it was quite justified, over messing about on stage or similar. The only slight hitch was when the follow spot broke down just before an evening show, and they had to send to Basildon Towngate Theatre to get a replacement. Peter was stalking the backstage corridors in his opening frock and wig, looking icy and angry, but that only added to the hilarity of the situation. Reviews for the show were very good, and I personally got a good write-up in the stage. I had my first experience of doing 3 shows a day, but as I was young and keen at the time, it was all part of the excitement of my first few months in the business. None of us wore radio microphones in those days. In fact, I did 3 pantomimes and a Christmas show before I even wore a radio microphone in 1998 on a tour at Paddington Bear. Instead, at Graze, there were about 3 microphones on stands across the front of the stage, into which the singers would direct their duets or solos, and Peter seemed to play the entire thing at the centre microphone. In fact, he even said in rehearsals, "I shall head for the centre microphone, and that's where I'm staying." The show made good use of old-fashioned musical numbers, with 2 from Sigmund Romberg's New Moon. It's almost like being in love from Brigadoon, and Peter even asked my help in sourcing an old Lily Morris Dora Bryan number, Because He Loves Me. He then followed this in Act 2 with Cicely Courtnage's The Empire Depends on You. As the band was only a piano and drums, everything had very much an end to the pier feel. I did have an amusing incident with one of my personal props. I thought it would be fun to have the sheriff lying across his throne in the Nottingham Castle scene with a goblet of wine. I was staying at my dear friend Richard Heggart's flat in Upton Park and noticed he had a battered old wine goblet that looked perfect. So, in his absence, I borrowed it every day for the performances, keeping it safe and bringing it home with me every night. It was only when Richard returned he mentioned in passing that it was a solid silver communion goblet. I quickly replaced it in his display cabinet and bought 2 stainless steel goblets from the charity shop after that. I was able to get away to the family in Gloucestershire for the one and only time in my theatrical career on Christmas Day and Boxing Day, as Peter said that traditionally Panto was never performed on these days, a not very convincing subterfuge so that he could have the festive period off with Mother. Mother's presence was very much in evidence at Graze, as she worked front of house and was constantly popping backstage to hold court. It came as no surprise that the late Patrick Fife of Hinch and Bracket fame had performed with Mother, Eileen Farrow, and there is much speculation as to whether there are elements of Miss Farrow in his landmark character of Dame Hilda Bracket. The run ended happily in early January, and I duly made my way back to Birmingham after 4 months of a very promising start in this business we call show.
Now, have no feeling, but way beyond healing, our fields and pastures new, from Chiswick to Clapham, and up goes an atom, the empire depends on you.
Part 7. The Final Shows. I didn't see a lot of Peter in the early part of 1993. I did a couple of concerts for Barry Stacey at Leicester and Wolverhampton, and then spent most of the summer in an open-air production of Treasure Island in Birmingham. Peter had been producing The King and I at the Yeovil, as he called it, and I subsequently found out what a fine production it was, with Peter as de Kralahom in My Sheriff of Nottingham Cape. Indeed, looking at the picture of it, Peter gave a very sympathetic performance. Peter had told us for a long time that in 1993 he was going to be touring one of the great Ivor Novello musicals, and of course I was very interested in being involved. I'd always loved Ivor Novello's music, and even though the shows are unproducible in this day and age, the music is pure heaven. Peter had many interesting anecdotes about Novello, most fabricated of course, including some of the props and furniture which he claimed to be from Ivor's shows. For instance, there was a brass and willow pattern pottery desk set that Peter claimed had been used in the original production of King's Rhapsody at the Palace Theatre. I didn't believe it until I saw some production shots of that scene, and looking carefully, it may just have been possible. As 1993 moved on, I rang Peter a few times to ask about what was now going to be Perchance to Dream. Even my dear friend Philip was willing to give up his job at High and Mighty and go on the road with the tour. As it turned out, the tour turned into 1 week only at the Yeovil. I wasn't asked to be involved and resigned myself to the fact pretty early on. Peter did offer me 1 week in Peterborough going on the book for a short tour of the opposite sex, a rather banal farce with Tony Adams, Deborah Caron, Damian Williams and Emma Sutton. I'd never actually gone on the corner, or book, before, but as I had received excellent stage management training at drama school, I wasn't fazed, and Peter paid for me to travel up to Chesterfield to watch the run backstage in order to prepare me for the week in Peterborough. I stayed with my friend from Ladies' Night, Richard Brett again, and his comments on the show pretty much summed it all up. The best part of the show was the set, and even though Tony Adams was gracious and professional to the hilt, there was nothing particularly memorable about this tired little farce. The setup was easy, the running of the show was minimal, and the week was uneventful. Peter popped up to Peterborough once to pay us all, and that was the only contact I had with him. And that seemed to be that until the middle of November, when Barry Stacey rang in the middle of 1 week and said, "Mama Bridge needs an ASM for Perchance to Dream. Can you get down to Southend today?" So I duly packed a bag and caught a train there and then and was in Southend by lunchtime, which from Birmingham wasn't bad. The cast included many familiar faces, Andrew Ryan, Alan Terry, and Lorraine Ashley, with whom I'd worked in A Murder Has Been Arranged, in the Roma Beaumont roles of Melanie and Melinda. Perchance the Dream is a beautiful spiritual show about 3 generations inhabiting the house Hunter's Moon. The first act is Regency, the second is Victorian, then modern day, well, 1950s, with a beautiful ghost finale with the spirits from the previous eras coming back to life for a reconciliation. I watched the afternoon rehearsals, and then mercifully was able to contact Richard Heggett to stay overnight with him in Upton Park before being sent up to London on the Friday to pick up 2 wigs from Derek Easton. Now, it must be remembered that this was long before mobile phones, and I was unable to contact anyone back in Southend to let them know that on my arrival at Derek's salon near Old Compton Street, that the coiffeur genius was nowhere to be seen. So there was nothing to do but wait. Eventually, after 2 p.m, Derek arrived, looking as if he was either wearing one of his own creations or had been under the dryer for some time. He eventually gave me a beautiful wig for the character of Lady Charlotte Fair, and a very strange Jean Harlow affair for Damian to wear as the vicar. I then had the journey back to Southend to try and make the end of rehearsals before they finished for the day. When Peter saw the vicar's wig, even he blanched a little, but worse was to come when we actually saw it on Damian at the technical rehearsal. I saw very little of actual rehearsals for Perchance to Dream, as I was either picking up wigs, arranging props, or some other job for Peter. I seem to remember we finished rehearsals in Southend on the Friday. 5 days to work on an Ivor Novello musical, ludicrous, and then I stayed with the mainstays, John and Russell, overnight, before we headed down to Yeovil for rehearsals on Saturday afternoon. It was the first time I'd seen a Mother in full flow. The casting of the show was bizarre, to say the least. Novello indicates in a libretto that the same actors double as certain characters to suggest the passing of the years. The most important doubling is that of the Olive Gilbert characters, Ernestine Flavel and Mrs. Bridport. Peter had cast Mother only as the Act 2 character of Mrs. Bridport. Mind you, 5 years later, I was to work with the legendary Patrick Fife in pantomime, and he told me a wonderful anecdote when he had played in Perchance to Dream in the late 60s, early 70s. Mother had been cast in both of the Olive Gilbert roles, but when she made her entrance in Act 2, Peter called out the immortal line, "Mother, you're supposed to look old," to which the diva had replied, "But I don't know how to, Peter," and she must have been at least 60 then. Mother was rehearsing the lead into We'll Gather Lilacs, and she had the classic line, "Oh, but my voice is so rusty." A look from Peter around the entire room forbade anyone to even raise a smile. The show had been cut very badly, but it still ran at 3 hours. The opening number had been cut, so too had the Act 1 Four Seasons ballet, and also was the beautiful Victorian wedding from Act 2. As rehearsals went on, more casualties from this classic Novello score fell by the wayside. Peter always had to find a scapegoat, and in this show it was Lorraine Ashley as Melinda and Melanie. I'd not only worked with her on Murder Has Been Arranged, but her drama teacher, and I use the adjective very loosely, had directed me in the open-air production of Treasure Island earlier on in 1993. Lorraine was, to put it mildly, rather self-indulgent, and her method acting approach was totally out of place in a weekly rep and doing a novello musical. One of her numbers, The Night When I Curtsied to the King, was the first casualty, and Rupert Ingham in the lead novello role has rather unwisely suggested that she sang it with an open vowel sound on the when. As a result, she pronounced it one, which caused a lot of derisive laughter and the famous look from Peter. Peter had also set the entire thing in one set, which sort of worked, but it made for some uncomfortable stage business. For instance, when Sir Amias and William, played by Peter and Andrew Ryan, are drugged by the novello character, the following bedroom insert scene was played on the full set, with Peter unconscious in an armchair and Andrew rather uncomfortably on the floor, whilst Lorraine and Rupert had to play a romantic scene with the pair of them behind them. Jean Bayliss was due to play the role of Lady Charlotte Fair, but she never even made it to rehearsals, so I never discovered what happened to her. I suspect that her performance in No Sex Please We're British a few months earlier had sealed her fate in Peter's bad books. The role was taken by Isabel Hurl, who was a joy to watch and very moving, especially in Act 2, a worthy successor to Margaret Rutherford, who'd first played the role in the 1950s. But even Isabel was suffering from a bad cold, and the worst was yet to come. The getting for the show took place on the Sunday morning, and a set that I was to see many times was duly erected. It was supplied by a gentleman called Paul Lascelles, who supplied practically all the scenery for Peter's pantomimes and what there had been of the Murder Has Been Arranged set. The set was a bog-standard panelled library affair, and over the next few years I was to see it used for Murder at the Vicarage, Sleuth, Time in the Conways, and even On Golden Pond. I'm sure it was even used for a hinge and bracket show at Buxton. The huge sweeping staircase, which is normally part of the Perchance a Dream set, was reduced to 4 treads up to a rostra, and some very odd pseudo-oil paintings were sent to adorn the walls. John Port even said that one of them looked like Mrs. Mangle from Neighbours. As the plot of Perchance progresses, more portraits of the past ancestors of Hunter's Moon are supposed to adorn the walls. Unfortunately, all we were supplied with were blown-up copies of Lorraine and Rupert's 10x8 publicity shots. In a stroke of genius, Peter announced, "We'll have the portraits on the 4th wall." This is the imaginary wall between stage and audience, basically cutting down the worry of creating lifelike portraits. I didn't argue with that one, with the clock ticking away. We did have a beautiful sofa and armchair from the Theatre Royal Handley production of Perchance to Dream, which Peter couldn't resist saying was Ivor Novello's original. Who knows, it may just have held credence. The orchestration for Perchance to Dream suffered greatly by being played on Russell's organ. Despite the state-of-the-art keyboard for 1993, the music still resembled a fairground organ, and it was only the romantic numbers played on the piano that held any poignancy. Peter had inserted one of Novello's most haunting melodies, Pray For Me, to cover the scene change between Victorian and modern day, and which was normally yet another reprise of We'll Gather Lilacs. It was truly beautiful, and sung to perfection by Helen Scales, replacing Mother, and Richard, with whom I'd done the one-nighter at the Grand Theatre Wolverhampton for Barry Stacey earlier that year. By the time the set had been erected, the technical rehearsal began around 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and what a marathon it was going to be. I can't recall getting to the end of the show whatsoever on that Sunday night, and we'd only reached the Act 1 number Highwayman Love by around 9 p.m. Peter was getting very frustrated by the chorus boys and announced, "The preparation," this is a dance term for preparing for a bend or dance move, "is awful. Only he," alluding to a chorus boy who was renowned for doing the splits, "is doing it right." There was a deathly hush, broken by Andrew Ryan's plaintive, "Show us your prep, love." to the nubile chorus boy. I have a feeling that we only ever got halfway through Act 2 and the frantic rendition of the Glow Glow, which Lorraine was trying to make the most of, having had her Act 1 solo cut by Peter by the end of that evening. Even so, it was midnight before we left the theatre. We returned as soon as we could the following day, and Peter had firm decisions where every prop and photograph was to be placed. I made detailed set diagrams, so nothing was left to chance. I can only assume that the principals had worked on the scenes that finished the show, mainly 3-hander scenes and only a couple of numbers. The dress rehearsal started around 3 p.m. and crawled along until 6 p.m. when Peter still had the ghost finale to set. I have to say he was a master at setting something in a hurry and obviously loved the material. The ghost finale to the show involves all the previous inhabitants coming back as if lost in time, and for once Peter's pantomime lighting of blue, green and red, in which he lit everything, worked beautifully. That, coupled with Helen Scales' rendition of Poor Lonely Mortals, made a very moving finale. But there was no time to wallow in the emotion of it all. We finished the finale and curtain calls at 7:10, reset the stage and went up at 7:30 p.m. on the dot. Because of the indisposition of Jean Bayliss, for whatever reason, I had to make an announcement. The only spare microphone was Helen's radio mic, attached to her ample cleavage, so every night I had to make this speech down her bosom. We just about got through the show without incident, but we had never properly rehearsed all the set changes up to performance speed. The most difficult was the change from Victorian to modern, whilst Helen, Alan, Richard and 2 others sang Pray For Me front of stage in front of the black tabs. Behind this we had to redress the entire set, including curtains at the windows, pillars, reposition the piano and a few pictures, not at all easy on that first performance. I heard an ominous hiss from Peter in the wings, "The piano's the wrong way round!" And indeed it was. The grand piano, which looked fairly impressive with a wooden keyboard, but alas, unlike salad days, the keys didn't work, so poor Rupert as the Ivor Novello character had to not only mime playing to Russell in the pit, but also had to cope with the fact that the keys stayed upright throughout. Our work was therefore completed on that first performance, and just enjoyed the romantic ghost finale, which was beautifully haunting and very moving, and brought a tear to my eye. All in all, it wasn't a bad opening night, given the enormity of the production. But seconds after the curtain fell, or closed, Lorraine accosted me and said she'd found a curtain hook on the top roster, and she'd almost tripped over it. Given the inadequacy of the rest of her method performance, I may have muttered that it may have enhanced her performance, or at least endeared herself more to the first night audience. But, having worked with her drama teacher 6 months earlier, I can see how a curtain ring would have distracted her inner motivation. I've since found out that my friend from drama school, Maurice Ord, had worked with Lorraine pre-drama school in 1989 on a touring community pantomime. I can only begin to imagine what she was like on that. The rest of the week passed without incident. I did some work for Peter in the office during the day, and even though he could still be aloof in the wings during the show, he always watched the show from the chair in the wings, even asking if the water off stage for the singers was fresh. There were no further traumas, apart from the fact that Mother only ever did the opening night, and then was too ill to continue. She swore Isabel Hurl had given her her cold, when poor Isabel was already poorly herself. Helen Scales took over Mother, which she should have been playing anyway, as she was already playing the younger version of Ernestine in Act 1. The problem was she looked younger in Act 2, which was a complete reversal of Patrick Fife's story. Helen played the roles until the end of the all-too-brief run. Sadly, the beautiful harmony of We'll Gather Lilacs was never recaptured, as no further rehearsals took place. For all, it was a very much scaled-down version, in one set with half the music missing, but it wasn't bad by weekly rep standards. The run finished, the set was packed up, to re-emerge in the following years as Murder at the Vicarage, Sleuth and On Golden Pond. On the last night, Peter gave his curtain speech of promising productions of Beauty and the Beast, Lock Up Your Daughters and The Sound of Music, starring Mother of course, plus Murder at the Vicarage with Dr. Evadne Hinge of Hinge and Bracket fame, which I really wanted to be a part of. Peter was off to direct Dr. Hinge, George Logan, in pantomime Snow White at Bognor, with himself as stepmother in Cinderella at Graze. I myself was off to Middlesbrough for a very short run as comic, of all things, in Dick Whittington for Mark Andrews. Peter told me to keep in touch. 1994. I was preparing to produce my first show, Bent, by Martin Sherman in Birmingham, and indeed had spent 6 months planning it using Peter's philosophy of a show is often no better in 3 weeks than had it been rehearsed in 1, in an effort to galvanise my cast into action for a 3-week rehearsal period. Barry Stacey rang me up in February and asked if I'd like to ASM and play a role in Murder Weekend and the Foam Mama Bridge, which I duly did. As usual, Barry had got the name of the show totally wrong, as I suspected, having seen a set plan in October for Write Me a Murder, which I think was the same set design as Perchance to Dream. Peter outlined the dates, which clashed with my rehearsals of Bent, which couldn't be altered, and so with much regret I had to refuse. Peter told me to keep in touch, and then cut to the penultimate night of Bent in March 1994, and we had a few demons haunting us in the shape of a stalker who had done a few silly things to try and wreck our publicity. Philip Leather and I were joking around backstage, and as Philip had encountered La Bridge in the past, and indeed Peter had arranged some shows for Philip as Douglas Byng, we were both doing our various impressions, when Rick Ashwell told us the news that Peter Bridge had died the previous week. Stunned just wasn't the word. I rang Sue Wolfson from drama school, who had worked for Peter on No Sex Please We're British, and she confirmed what Rick had told us. She also told us the funeral was the following day, our last night of Bent, so I couldn't attend. I rang John and Russell and they told me the full story. Peter, John, Russell, Bruce James and the full company, including Andrew Ryan and Alan Terry, were assembled in Chesterfield to start rehearsals for the new musical Beauty, written by Peter with music by Russell. They'd all been out the night before and had had a great night. Peter had declined to go out with the boys that night, but there was no animosity. Everyone assembled, as was the norm, in Ivy's cafe across the road for morning coffee, awaiting Peter, who was never late. As time went on, they made their way over to the Pomegranate Theatre to start rehearsals. Peter still didn't arrive. Eventually, Alan Terry rang the hotel where Peter stayed, and coming back to Russell and the company, he broke the news that Peter had been found dead in his room in bed. The boys rushed across the road to the hotel on Alan's insistence, as he knew the contents of Peter's briefcase contained material that would have caused Eileen great distress. Alan obviously disposed of everything suspect, which was very quick thinking. Stunned, the company drifted back to rehearsals to console and tell the rest of the company. The Write Me a Murder company arrived and played the show that night. Bruce James told the company that even though Peter's bank account and the estate etc. were herewith frozen, he would try and keep the company going somehow to produce Beauty. The cast out of loyalty hung on even though wages were late in coming. Much of that story was relayed to me later when I joined Bruce's new company in October for The Sound of Music and the eagerly awaited Murder at the Vicarage. An amusing anecdote concerned Ivy's cafe opposite the Pomegranate Theatre in Chesterfield. If Ivy liked you, she would charge you less than the other customers and overcharge others. Upon entering her cafe, now long gone, she would regale her bill of fare. We got beef, meat and potato pie. On the day Peter died, those that went to her establishment for lunch as usual regaled that no sooner had they entered, Ivy in mock fluster proclaimed, in full Derbyshire dialect, "Oh, isn't it sad about Peter?" closely followed by, "Now we've got meat, beef, meat and potato pie," etc., etc. So that was the end of the Bridge years, barely 18 months. At times they were difficult, and Peter could be a sod to newcomers, but for me it was the most extraordinary start to the theatrical profession, so much so that I often ask myself now, was it just a dream, perchance? I hope that by recounting these days it will bring a bit of history into perspective, touring rep, weekly rep, a theatrical presentation put on against all odds and at breakneck speed. It gave me a discipline and a professionalism that has carried me through the last 30-odd years. I will never forget the man, and I doubt if anyone who worked with him or for him ever will. Rest in peace, Peter, in the heavenly realm.